Welcome to ITF Plus Training, Episode 2 of Chapter 1. We're going to talk about introducing ourselves to internal components on the computer. So we're going to talk about motherboards and things along those lines. Join me on this episode. Welcome back, and thank you for continuing to join us on the IT Fundamentals podcast. We are now in Chapter 1, Episode 2. On Episode 1, we talked about definitions and foundations, and on this one, we're going to talk about introducing internal components of the computer. We are on page 3 of the book, and we're going to continue on with page 4 and onward as we go through this process. All right, so first of all, let's just talk about internal components and what we're speaking of here. So we're talking about the internal components of a computer. So if you have a computer desktop, we're talking about the pieces that are on the inside of that make up what a computer does and is. So from remembering from yesterday when we talked about on episode 1 about definitions and foundations, here, we're talking about the motherboard or the system board. We're talking about RAM. We're talking about CPU. We're talking about the things that go inside of there. If we're looking at a laptop, again, what goes on inside the case, but maybe not the monitor. And if we're talking about a thing like a tablet or a phone, iPad, iPhone, Android, something like that, we're predominantly talking about the system board there because everything is contained on that. So when we talk about the introduction of internal computers, the very first thing that they want us to understand and take a look at is to explore motherboards, processing, and memory. All right. So that's on page 4 and page 5. And what I wanted you to do is turn your attention to page 5, figure 1.1, which is a motherboard. Now, motherboard is somewhat of a old-fashioned term, but they still use it here in this book. I personally like it because I've been around for my entire career, but most of people these days call it a system board because of some of the gender equality things that are out there, but also really we've just moved beyond being the mother of all things, which is how it got its name, is that every single thing that a computer attached or that made a computer work is essentially went to that board. Now we're talking about other pieces and other components that can sit outside of that, and it's not as applicable as it used to be. But let's just take a look at figure 1.1. And if you have your book, if you don't have your book, let me just quickly describe what we're looking at in figure 1.1. What we're looking at is, first of all, it is a black and white page, but I can tell you that it would be a green, most likely a green board that's made of a plastic or something similar to that. And the reason they're made of plastic or fiberglass type of material is, number one, it's hard. Number two is they don't conduct electricity. In other words, they don't allow for static electricity. They don't allow for the electricity that's input into that board for proper purposes to jump, if you will, and go to the wrong pieces. So the boards are designed to be anti-static, anti-electrical conductors, if you will. So really, you can touch the side of a motherboard that is powered or a system board that is powered and not get electrocuted. And to be fair, you're probably not going to get electrocuted anyway. You might get a little bit of a buzz if you were to touch one of the electrical components, because usually what's coming out of the back end of that power supply that leads to the system board is a fairly low voltage. It's not something that can typically cause you great harm unless you have a medical device or something along those lines. All right, so the system boards are made by a large number of folks, by folks like Asus, MicroStar. They talk about both of those in the book here. So again, we're looking at a green board, and I like to kind of put a parallel, if you will, is it's as if you were looking on Google Earth down at a large city, because a lot of the motherboard or the system board looks like that. You've got some components that stick up really tall, and some other ones that are very low in profile. You have some that are taking up very large space real estate wise. And then you can kind of see these paths going through there that look like roads, and those paths that go through there are the places, if you will, that we've been able to use solder and wires in order to connect the various components. So on this system board, there's a few things I want to point out that we're looking at, and if you have your own system board, I'd recommend taking a look at that. So first of all, right in the middle of the picture and just slightly to the left, you see a large white square. Okay, that is typically where your CPU or your central processing unit goes. Remember yesterday when we were talking about the CPU, that's your brain. That's where all the mathematical computations occur. That plugs into the system board. The right below that, there's a series of what appears to be 4 different black lines, and on the ends of those lines they have little clips. That is where your random access memory, your RAM chips, go, right in there. Just below that, right smack in the middle, at the bottom edge, are a series of what looks like little square plugs, and that is where your power will go into. All right. At the very top, in the center and off to the right, are components that allow you to plug in your USB, your VGA, and other types of plug-in input devices. So remember, we talked about input like keyboards, mouse, things like that. That's what's up there at the top. And then on the far left, you'll see a white skinny rectangle there. That is where you would put in your extension boards or your expansion boards, and things like your graphical cards and so on and so forth would go in there. Now, a couple of things I want to talk about that if you were having a motherboard or a system board in front of you, one of the things I like about modern boards is you typically, and I've yet to find one in the last 10 years or so, where you can plug in some of these things that we just talked about incorrectly into the board. So it used to be, when I was much younger, 30 plus years ago doing this work, if I put the RAM in, I could literally put it in backwards and blow my entire board. But now they have little notches in them that you just physically cannot push them in the wrong way. On your CPU, a corner of it looks like all on that item that on the picture here looks like a whole bunch of little holes in there, and that's really what it is. The CPU has a whole bunch of little prongs that hang out from underneath it. You put that on there and it looks like you possibly could put it in the wrong way. Well, you really can't, because if you look very closely in the top, in the corners there are notches in there, and there's only one way in which you can properly put that CPU into that slot. And then if you're down on things like the power piece, again, right down on the bottom, right in the middle, the power going into that board, if you look really closely there, each one of those inserts, although if you're not looking closely, they just look like squares, they actually are squares, and they have some diagonal pieces in them as well that make it so you could only plug these things in the right way. So what I'm telling you is, when I first started this stuff, you had to be fearful that you would blow your board, and boards were $300 or $400 at least back then. They're much cheaper now. Nowadays, you don't have to worry about accidentally blowing your board from a power perspective, or jamming something in the wrong way. It just physically won't allow you to do that. So motherboards, system boards are designed to be the core where all of these components come together and work. All right. So if we move over to page 6, you get introduced to some new terminology that we'll talk about in this particular conversation, and then we'll pick up with a little bit later. But you're looking at form factors and chipsets and processor sockets and memory slots and all those. Those are the formal terms for the things that I just talked about. So form factors over on table 1.1, these are actually the specifications, if you will, that the motherboards are made in. So you see it goes all the way back to 1985 down to the Neo ITX, which was in 2012. Now, I'm going to tell you, you do not need to memorize or know these form factors on these system boards. So don't get nervous on that for the test, okay? Just know that there are different form factors, and probably know that the The more modern one is the Neo. Neo is the word new. So the Neo ITX or the mobile ITX. These are boards for mobile devices. And Neo is new type of scenario. Mini ITX for smaller computers. So if you kind of remember that ITX function, you're probably in enough to know for the testing purposes. Okay. So these form factors and things along those lines are just reading over and understanding that there are different form factors is what you need to know, and you do not need to memorize each one of those. All right. So we're going to go ahead and leave it off there for today, and then we'll pick up with page 8 tomorrow, and we'll talk about chipsets. Hopefully that was a little bit of an explanation, and you'll enjoy tomorrow's conversation as well.